The architecture of the moat. The architecture of the moat, quantitative stability, ontological security, and the mechanics of state-backed financial armor. Nemo Sign Press International, ISBN 978-1-6011-8-2734-5, 9,781,600-300. ISBN 9,781,631,182,345. Austin E. Cruz, Jr. Official publication metadata title, The Architecture of the Moat. Subtitle, Quantitative Stability, Ontological Security, and the Mechanics of State-Backed Financial Armor. Byline, Austin E. Delacruz, Jr., Primary Investigator. Collaboration with the Editorial 7. Nemosine Press International, LLC, ISBN 978-1-9702-141-11-3. Dedication. This volume is resolutely dedicated to Carmencita Karmi Ursua Delacruz, RRT-NPS, Respiratory Care Practitioner. On July 19, 2026, at exactly 7, the final vigil of a supervisory respiratory care practitioner concludes. Following a distinguished career spanning over 31 years within a Vallejo, Northern California mega healthcare infrastructure, the final 23-7 night shift marks the definitive threshold. The transition from active clinical duty into the armored distribution phase is earned, representing the absolute reclamation of time. Furthermore, this treatise is dedicated to Austin III, Aubrey Lizette, and Karmina Lindsey along with their spouses, and to Kiara as she approaches her 8th year. As this next generation trudges the complex and demanding trajectories of the American workforce, navigating the friction of accumulation, may these pages serve as the architectural blueprint for their own sovereign fortresses. Let it guide them toward the construction of their distinct moats, the ultimate molt of the grown in toto, where financial defense is absolute and true ontological security is permanently secured. Book description. In the modern macroeconomic landscape, the transition from the active accumulation of labor to the passive distribution of retirement is fraught with systemic vulnerability. Standard financial planning relies on an inherently flawed model of managed attrition, forcing retirees to cannibalize their life savings while battling market volatility, sequence of returns risk, and escalating healthcare costs. This traditional trajectory creates a psychological phantom of scarcity, trapping an perpetual state of existential dread over finite resources. The architecture of the moat, quantitative stability, ontological security, and the mechanics of state-backed financial armor completely dismantles this obsolete framework. Primary investigator Austin E. Delacruz, Jr., in collaboration with the editor, presents an empirical, multi-tiered blueprint for achieving absolute socio-economic defense. This volume transcends standard retail wealth management, offering a definitive treatise on securing true ontological security through the strategic alignment of government-backed inflation index distribution networks. Spanning 4 comprehensive treatises, the textbook meticulously deconstructs the hierarchy of post-labor survival. It contrasts the extreme fragility of the non-moat paradigm against the transitional mechanics of the hybrid moat, before fully operationalizing the ultimate objective, the moat-armored retirement. By Anchold's baseline architecture within statutory federal distribution vectors, the moat achieves a zero drawdown mandate on primary capital reserves. It transforms a standard private portfolio into a self-sustaining sovereign fortress, rendering it mathematically immune to geographic tax traps, macroeconomic recessions, and localized economic depressions. Beyond analyzing the distribution phase, this text serves as a vital projection manual for the active American workforce. By mapping the strategic trajectories of the 30 to -59 age cohorts, it provides tactical directives for accumulating institutional service credits, mitigating taxation drag, and escaping the systemic accumulation traps that severely cripple traditional working-class wealth generation. Grounded in rigorous quantitative analysis and the principles of cathartic phenomenology, the architecture of the moat permanently disarms the psychological of resource exhaustion. It is the definitive operational manual for constructing a financial defense so impenetrable that it facilitates the absolute reclamation of time, behavioral autonomy, and the permanent preservation of generational legacy. Official author biography. Austin Estigoy Jr., primary investigator. Austin Estigoy Delacruz Jr. is a primary investigator, phenomenologist, and research methodologist specializing in socioeconomic architecture, institutional systems, and generational wealth defense. With a total of 35 years of federal service, it encompasses uniformed service under the Department of Defense and extensive civilian tenure with the Department of Veterans Affairs and the Veterans Health Administration. A retired United States Air Force veteran, his final active duty assignment utilized his expertise as the U.S. Air Force Air Education and Training Command Pulmonary Phase II Clinical Course. Supervisor of the Air Force Specialty Code, AFSC, 4H0 Con, Cardiopulmonary, as well as subject matter expert, SME, and item writer for Skills Knowledge Testing, SKT, for USAF Active Duty Rank Promotions and Testing. Following his military retirement, he served as the Director of Clinical Education for 2 cardiopulmonary and respiratory health education institutions in Northern California, where he was deeply engaged in adult professional development and workforce trajectories. His analytical approach is rigorously supported by his academic. He holds a Doctor of Health Administration candidacy and a Master of Education in Adult Education and Training from the University of Phoenix School of Advanced Studies, as well as a Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy from the University of Santo Tomas. This multidisciplinary progression merges the quantitative rigors of business administrationomics and complex healthcare infrastructure management with the qualitative depth of existential philosophy. Now officially retired from clinical practice, Delacruz dedicates his time to scholastic writing, authoring books, articles, and journals, while conducting extensive field studies and logging phenomenological explorations of loci and historical events from which humanity can extract profound lessons. Through his nonprofit efforts and active mentoring, he passionately advocates for and stewards 4 core pillars: veritas, equitas, pax, and prosperitas. It is to guide individuals toward achieving the ultimate developmental molt, becoming fully grown in toto. Currently, he develops specialized methodologies, including cathartic phenomenology and the trademarked concept of moral ethics. His quantitative projections and textbook manuscripts undergo rigorous and collaborative vetting by an oversight group of de-identified senior executive service retirees designated as the editorial 7. He publishes his findings through Nemausenstein Press International, LLC, translating decades of institutional expertise into definitive blueprints for physical security. The architecture of the moat, quantitative stability, ontological security, and the mechanics of state-backed financial armor. Austin E. Delacruz Jr., primary investigator. Developed in collaboration with Editorial 7. Nemausenstein Press International, ISBN 9780-270-2141-11-3. Disclaimer and Safe Harbor Clause. This volume constitutes a theoretical, phenomenological, and macroeconomic architectural study. The quantitative projections, withdrawal rates, and institutional vector analyses detailed within these treatises are presented strictly for scholastic and educational purposes. Austin E. Delacruz Jr., Editorial 7, and Nemausenstein Press International, LLC, are not licensed financial advisors, certified public accountants, or companies. The frameworks contained herein, including the moat armored paradigm, do not constitute individualized financial, legal, or tax advice. Readers are operating autonomously and must engage qualified licensed fiduciaries before executing capital transitions or altering federal distribution strategies. Material within this text. Dedication. This volume is resolutely dedicated to Carmencita, Karmi Ursua Delacruz, RRT-NPS. On July 19, 2026, at exactly 7, the final vigil of a supervisory respiratory care practitioner, Following a distinguished career spanning over 31 years within a Vallejo, Northern California mega healthcare infrastructure, the final 2003-7 night shift marks the definitive threshold. The transition from active clinical duty into the armored distribution phase is earned, representing the absolute reclamation of time. Furthermore, this treatise is dedicated to Austin III, Aubrey Lizette, and Karmina Lindsey, along with their spouses, and to Kiara as she approaches her 8th year. As this next generation trudges the complex and demanding trajectories of the American workforce, navigating the friction of accumulation serve as the architectural blueprint for their own sovereign fortresses. Let it guide them toward the construction of their distinct moats, achieving the ultimate molt of the grown in toto, where financial defense is absolute and true ontological security is permanently secured. Preface: the ascetic directive is not a retail product. It is a ledger of stewardship. After 35 years of service, spanning the uniform of the Department of Defense to the complex healthcare infrastructure of the Department of Veterans Affairs, the nature of my labor has undergone a definitive transformation. For decades, the mechanics of supervision govern professional life, managing cardiopulmonary clinical training, supervising the rigors of Air Force Specialty Code 4 H0-CAX-1, and navigating the institutional demands of federal civil service. That phase of accumulation is concluded. I am now officially retired from clinical practice. The requirement for service remains absolute. We live in an age where the American workforce is systematically encouraged to embrace a life of perpetual extraction. We are taught to accumulate until our strength wanes, and then to cannibalize our own reserves until we are depleted. This is the antithesis of the toto state. It is a cycle that feeds on human anxiety, profiting from the phantom of scarcity while undermining the ontological security of the family unit. The transition from accumulation to stewardship is the primary directive of this text. To steward is to protect, to teach, and to provide an architectural blueprint for those who follow. It is an ascetic practice. It requires setting aside self-interest in favor of the mission's integrity. My labor now is directed toward the mapping of loci, the places where human history and systemic policy intersect, to extract the profound lessons necessary for the preservation of the lineage. The work contained within these treatises has not been developed in a vacuum. It is the product of continuous combing and collaborative vetting by the Editorial 7, a dedicated oversight group whose commitment to the pillars of veritas, equitas, pax, and prosperitas ensures that this manual by the standard rhetoric of market-driven fiscal management. This is the architecture of the moat. It is for those who are ready to stop being acted upon by systemic forces and to begin constructing their own sovereign fortresses. It is time to reclaim the time. Introduction: Cathartic Phenomenology and the Phantom of Scarcity. Treatise 1. The Taxonomy of Post-Labor States. To construct the moat, we must first map the terrain. We define 3 states of retirement, each representing a distinct relationship between the individual and their socio-economic environment. Chapter 1. The non-moat paradigm. Extreme fragility, managed attrition, and market vulnerability. The modern American economic system operates on a fundamental, institutionalized misdirection. For 4 decades, the active workforce has been conditioned to believe that ontological security is the sheer accumulation of fiat currency and retail equities. Workers are instructed to siphon portions of their labor into standard tax-deferred vehicles, 401ks, 403bs, and traditional IRAs, with the promise that a sufficiently large numerical balance will guarantee a peaceful distribution phase. The lens of cathartic phenomenology, we observe that this promise is a structural delusion. It creates the non-moat paradigm, the default hyper-vulnerable state of the standard American retiree. The non-moat architecture is not a fortress, it is a fragile, finite reservoir placed directly in the economic predators. Its structural failure is guaranteed not by personal fiscal irresponsibility, but by the systemic doctrine upon which it is built. 1.1. The doctrine of managed attrition. Standard retail wealth management relies on the concept of systematic decumulation, marketed as the 4% rule. This doctrine requires that a retiree liquidate a percentage of their primary capital reserves each year to generate the cash flow needed for basic survival. This model forces the individual into an adversarial, zero-sum relationship with their own lifespan. Foundationality is shrinking. They are no longer generating resources. They are merely managing their own systemic depletion. Under these conditions, achieving peace is biologically and psychologically impossible, as the dwindling ledger constantly triggers the mind's evolutionary survival scripts. This is the point of the phantom of scarcity. 1.2. The triad of fragility. Because the non-moat portfolio lacks the state-backed armor of federal indexing, it is entirely exposed to the elements. As mapped in our structural schematics, the standard portfolio is relentlessly besieged by three compounding extraction forces. First sequence of returns risk, the mathematical guillotine. Standard wealth management operates on average historical market returns. However, retirees do not live on the average. They live in the immediate. Sequence of returns risk, SRR, of market returns is infinitely more critical than the long-term average. In the accumulation phase, market volatility is a tool for growth. In the distribution phase of a non-moat retiree, it is a catastrophic extraction mechanism. If a standard worker retires and immediately faces a 2-year macroeconomic recession, they are forced to sell their depreciating equities at a massive loss to buy groceries. This is the fatal flaw of the non-moat architecture. Operational survival is permanently tethered to Wall Street performance. Selling assets at a deficit permanently hollows out the primary capital base. Even if the market's historic bull run a decade later, the portfolio lacks the critical mass to recover. Zweite, taxation and inflation drag, the silent extraction. A standard retail portfolio is a highly visible static target for federal extraction and macroeconomic decay. Because traditional distributions are treated as ordinary income, the state immediately reclaims a significant percentage of every dollar liquidated. Concurrently, inflation acts as a silent compounding tax on the bottom line. Unlike the statutory cost of living adjustments, COLA, that shield sovereign pensions, standard marks do not automatically scale to protect purchasing power. A withdrawal rate that feels adequate at age 60 will possess devastatingly low purchasing power by age 75. Third, the medical hemorrhage, the apex predator of capital. The standard American financial model operates under the danger that basic Medicare and supplemental private insurance are sufficient to insulate the aging individual. Empirical observation proves otherwise. Within the civilian sector, late-stage healthcare costs function as a rapid wealth extraction mechanism. A single acute medical event or chronic condition requiring long-term care can instantly shatter a traditional withdrawal strategy. Without premium access or zero-cost institutional networks, such as the Veterans Health Administration infrastructure used in the moat armored model, the non-moat retiree is forced to liquidate their remaining core assets to cut out-of-pocket expenses. 1.3. The phenomenological deficit, a life not fully grown. When we strip away the sanitized charts of corporate wealth advisors, the lived experience of the non-moat retiree is one of systematic regression. They have not achieved the ultimate molt. They are not grown in toto. These individuals remain subjects acted upon by external forces. Instead of achieving behavioral autonomy, their daily mood is dictated by the opening bell of the stock market and the fluctuations of the consumer price index. They actively restrict their own lifestyles, skip preventative medical procedures to preserve capital, and live in constant fear of outliving their money. The non-moat paradigm is inherently unethical when viewed through the framework of moral ethics. It demands a lifetime of physical and cognitive labor, only to reward the laborer with a fragile, mathematically doomed architecture that strips them of their remedy in their final years. 1.4. The necessity of the transition. The non-moat model is the baseline, but it is not a mandatory life sentence. Recognizing its extreme fragility is the first required step towards structural liberation. It is the catalyst that forces the individual to seek an alternative architecture, one that decouples daily survival from market volatility. For those who recognize the trap early enough, the journey toward absolute defense begins in the transitional territory. We must now examine the operational mechanics of those who have secured partial institutional reliance, creating a bridge toward the ultimate fortress. Chapter 2. The Hybrid Moat Paradigm. Transitional mechanics, partial pensions, and standard healthcare reliance. Between the extreme fragility of the standard retail portfolio and the absolute structural defense of the moat-armored fortress lies a vast, complex middle ground. This is the hybrid moat. It is the operational reality for a specialized segment of the American workforce: mid to late career professionals, municipal workers, career educators, and specialized healthcare practitioners. These individuals have managed to secure a partial institutional foothold, a single defined benefit civilian pension, a corporate or a robust early-stage social insurance payout, alongside their traditional private retirement savings. Through the lens of cathartic phenomenology, the hybrid moat represents a state of partial autonomy. Wall Street no longer entirely subjugates the individual, but they have not yet achieved the total immunity required for true ontological security. The phantom of scarcity still lingers, albeit reduced to a low hum rather than a deafening alarm. 2.1. The mechanics of partial insulation. The defining structural feature of the hybrid moat is the bifurcated nature of its income stream. The household serves on a dual-engine architecture. 1. The institutional baseline, the fixed shield, a guaranteed monthly inflow, for example, a civilian hospital pension or municipal retirement, engineered to cover absolute baseline survival metrics, the primary mortgage, essential utilities, and foundational nutrition. 2. The private drawdown, the variable exposure, a traditional investment portfolio, 401k IRA, that must be actively liquidated to fund discretionary variables, travel, property maintenance, lifestyle inflation, and non-covered medical expenses. Unlike the non-moat retiree, who must liquidate assets for every expense, the hybrid moat operator uses their fixed pension to offset their core survival costs. This significantly reduces the required withdrawal rate from the private portfolio. Instead of a highly destructive 4% or 5% annual drawdown, the hybrid operator frequently operates at a much safer 1.5% to 2.5% liquidation rate. 2.2. The variable drawdown and SRR mitigation. This compressed drawdown provides significant, though incomplete, insulation against sequence of returns risk, SRR. If the globe experiences a severe recession early in retirement, the hybrid operator is not forced into the fatal error of selling depreciated assets to keep the lights on. They possess the structural ability to temporarily halt discretionary withdrawals, tighten their lifestyle, and survive purely on their fixed institutional baseline until market recovers. The macroeconomic downturn bruises them, but unlike the non-moat retiree, they are not destroyed. The vulnerabilities of the transitional state. Despite the presence of a baseline shield, the hybrid moat remains structurally incomplete. The architecture actively bleeds cap on two critical fronts. First, the civilian pension inflation trap. Unlike federal statutory vectors, VA, DFS, that are legally mandated to scale with inflation, many civilian or corporate pensions lack robust cost of living adjustments, COLA. A $4,000 monthly civilian secured at age 60 provides profound initial stability. However, by age 75, after 15 years of macroeconomic inflation, the true purchasing power of that static stream has been severely eroded. As the baseline's utility shrinks, the required drawdown from the private portfolio must cease to fill the gap, systematically dragging the operator back toward the fragility of the non-moat model late in life. Zweite, standard healthcare reliance, the incomplete shield. The most severe vulnerability of the hybrid moat is its reliance on the standard civilian healthcare apparatus. While the operator possesses a pension, they often lack priority access to premium, zero-cost federal medical infrastructure, such as the Veterans Health Administration or TRICARE, used in the fully armored model. The hybrid retiree is reliant on standard Medicare and expensive civilian supplemental Medigap plans. Consequently, their reserves remain fully exposed to the hemorrhage in the medical sector. A single catastrophic health event, or the escalating out of pocket costs of civilian long-term care, can rapidly deplete the secondary capital engine, instantly breaching the partial defenses. 2.4 Geographic arbitrage. The tactical because the hybrid moat is only partially insulated against inflation and taxation, its operators are often forced to rely on geographic arbitrage as a primary defense. Unlike the moat-armored operator who possesses absolute geographic autonomy and can comfortably absorb the high property taxes of premium coastal zones like Northern California, operator must actively seek out structural inefficiencies in the national economy. To artificially stretch their fixed pension and lower their required drawdown rate, the hybrid retiree must often flee high-cost metropolitan areas and retreat to mid-tier economic zones or zero-income tax states out of mathematical necessity. This is a tactical retreat. While mathematically sound, this maneuver exacts a phenomenological toll. The forced separation from established family networks, preferred climates, and historical loci solely to balance a spreadsheet. It is a survival move, not a sovereign choice. 2.5 Phenomenological state, the lingering phantom. The psychological reality of the hybrid moat is perpetual vigilance. The hybrid operator has achieved a measure of equitas. They have secured a partial return on their lifetime of labor. However, they have not fully achieved pax. Because their discretionary lifestyle and late-stage medical survival remain tethered to the stock market and civilian healthcare costs, they cannot fully disengage their nervous systems from macroeconomic vigilance. They exist in a state of perpetual management, constantly balancing the math of their fixed baseline against the unpredictable variable world. To achieve total liberation from this vigilance, the architecture must be fundamentally upgraded. It must transition from partial reliance to absolute sovereign defense. Chapter 3. The Moat, Armored Paradigm. Absolute defense, zero drawdown mandate, and true ontological security. The apex of socioeconomic defense is not achieved by accumulating a larger pile of fragile private equities. It is achieved by fundamentally altering the physics of personal finance. This is the moat armored paradigm. It is an absolute, unbreachable fortress constructed through decades of strategic alignment with state-backed, institutional distribution vectors. For the primary investigator and the editorial 7, this is not a theoretical model. It is the lived, empirical reality. When a household aligns its operational survival with the statutory backing of the United States government, stacking tax, exempt, inflation, indexed, revenue streams such as VA disability, DFAS military retirement, OPM civil service, and SSA, the entire framework of American retirement is inverted. The individual transcends management. They achieve true ontological security and realize the ultimate developmental molt, becoming fully grown in toto. 3.1 The zero drawdown mandate. The definitive mechanical feature that separates the moat from both the non-moat and hybrid models is the zero drawdown mandate. Its architecture, the guaranteed monthly institutional cash flow, is engineered to completely eclipse total baseline and discretionary living expenses. 1. The empirical reality. Consider a moat generating a guaranteed passive monthly inflow of $11,229.05, annualized at $134,748. This revenue is completely decoupled from the stock market. Because this inflow fully funds the household's operational survival, the required drawdown rate on the primary liquid capital reserve, for example, $1 million plus, is exactly 0%. 2. The eradication of SRR, sequence of returns risk, is mathematically neutralized. If the global equity markets experience a catastrophic 40% collapse on the day of retirement, the moat-armored operator does, nor do they sell a single depreciated asset. Federal deposits entirely insulate their daily survival. The primary capital reserve ceases to be a survival life raft and transforms into an untouchable compounding engine for generational wealth transfer. The state. Point 2. The state-backed armor to the triad. The moat is specifically designed to repel the three extraction forces that obliterate standard portfolios. First, asymmetric tax immunity and statutory indexing, defeating inflation. Standard retirees bleed capital through ordinary income tax and inflation. The moat deploys asymmetric shielding. A substantial portion of this specific architecture, such as VA disability compensation, is completely exempt from both federal and state income taxation. Furthermore, unlike civilian pensions, federal vectors are permanently tethered to statutory cost-of living adjustment (COLA). As macroeconomic inflation spikes, the moat automatically scales upward. The fortress's purchasing power expands automatically, ensuring its defenses are stronger at age 80 than at age 60. Zweite, institutional medical shielding, defeating the medical hemorrhage. The heir of late-stage capital, civilian healthcare costs, cannot breach the moat. By combining decades of civilian healthcare expertise with priority access to premium, zero-cost federal medical infrastructures, such as the Veterans Health Administration and TRICARE, the moat-armored retiree completely bypasses the standard. Catastrophic out-of-pocket expenses are structurally eliminated, preserving the primary capital reserve against biological attrition. Third, absolute geographic autonomy, defeating arbitrage. Because the moat's income is massive, tax-advantaged, and strictly indexed, the op never forced into tactical retreat. They do not need to flee to depressed economic zones or zero-tax states to survive. The moat can effortlessly absorb the high property taxes and inflation of premium coastal zones, such as Northern California, without ever tapping the principal. They choose their loci based on preference, family, and historical resonance, not mathematical desperation. 3.3. Cathartic phenomenology, the death of the phantom. When the primary investigator applies cathartic phenomenology to the moat-armored operator, a profound psychological silence is observed. The phantom of scarcity. For the first time in their adult life, the individual's nervous system is permanently allowed to disengage from the evolutionary survival script of accumulation. The amygdala recognizes that the resource supply is infinite relative to the lifespan. The anxiety of not enough is exposed as an obsolete neurobiological. This is the manifestation of pax, peace, and veritas, truth. The individual realizes that their time is finally their own. They are no longer subjects of the economic system. They are the sovereign administrators of their own ledger. 3.4. The stewardship of the moat. Achieving the moat brings forth a new ethical imperative governed by moral ethics. Once the fortress is secure and the individual is grown in toto, the mission shifts entirely to stewardship. The preserved, untouched capital becomes a legacy instrument, used to support independent research like mnemosynes, fund philanthropic fieldwork, and provide an unshakable architectural blueprint for the lineage, the children and grandchildren, as they navigate their own working years. The transition is complete. The vigil is over. The armor is absolute. 3.5. The empirical case study. From Operation Fiery Vigil to the Sovereign Fortress. The moat-armored paradigm is not a theoretical abstraction generated in a corporate wealth management seminar. To comprehend its true architectural weight, it must be observed through the lens of lived experience and strict empirical math. The ultimate moat is rarely inherited. It is constructed through a dual-engine sacrifice of uniformed service and unyielding civilian expertise, often originating from a state of absolute depletion. Consider the origin point of our empirical case study, currently situated within the Fairfield-Vacaville-Vallejo corridor of Northern California. Focus begins in June 1991, in the immediate chaotic aftermath of the catastrophic volcanic eruption of Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines. Following the emergency evacuation protocols of Operation Fiery Vigil, Karmi, departing from the 13th Air Force Medical Center, 13th AFMC at Clark Air Base, arrived alongside her active-duty military husband at Travis Air Force Base, zip code 94535. The initial financial baseline of this family unit was not merely zero, it was fundamentally compromised by geopolitical upheaval. The household arrived on American soil carrying a negative net worth of negative $2,000. Operating on the extreme margins of survival, the active-duty husband's military pay, after baseline deductions, left a net discretionary liquidity of exactly $150 per month, distributed as a fragile $75 bi-week margin. This is the absolute zero point of the American accumulation phase, a state of severe resource scarcity in which macroeconomic and environmental forces acted entirely upon the subjects. The crucible of the crossroads, the refusal to yield. The trajectory from this zero point was not linear ascent. A critical, life-altering fork in the road defined it. In the preliminary stages of rebuilding their foundation in the United States, Carmi took entry-level employment at a McDonald's in North Texas to generate immediate, fractional liquidity for the family. Recognizing that baseline labor would yield the capital required to build a permanent defense, she made the decisive pivot to pursue advanced medical education. However, this pursuit immediately collided with the apex predator of the working class, catastrophic medical trauma. While attempting to secure the family's long-term future through schooling, she was confronted with a critical emergency. Their young son faced a severe medical crossroads at Oakland Children's Hospital, hovering precariously between surviving and perishing. The standard socioeconomic response to such a catastrophic event is capitulation. Most families in the non-moat or accumulation phase are forced to their long-term educational or professional trajectories to manage the immediate crisis, permanently altering their earning potential and surrendering to the system. Karmi rejected the binary choice. Through sheer phenomenological will and the highest application of moral ethics, she assumed maximum risk on multiple fronts. She refused to abandon the immediate biological vigil at her son's bedside in Oakland, and she refused to abandon the grueling clinical education required to secure the family's future. By taking on the immense physical and psychological burden of both timelines, she forced the architecture into existence. She both risks to survive the immediate trauma and secure the long-term moat. The dual-engine construction, the 31-year vigil, with the credentials secured and the immediate crisis survived, the ascent to the impenetrable sovereign fortress required decades of unrelenting bifurcated. 1. The federal engine, the active-duty husband, executed an aggregate of 35 years of federal service, stacking concurrent service credits across Department of Defense uniform duty and subsequent civilian federal tenure. This vector was engineered specifically to lock in multiple inflation state-backed revenue streams. 2. The elite civilian vigil. Simultaneously, Karmi initiated her grueling 31-year clinical vigil. Operating as a supervisory respiratory care practitioner, RRT-NPS, within a Vallejo mega healthcare infrastructure. This labor was executed in the absolute trenches of civilian survival, the 23-7 night shift. This multi-decade nocturnal sacrifice neutralized the household's operational friction, funding the family's survival in a premium cost state and allowing the federal vector to compound undisturbed. The apogee of the architecture, by the Thermont, July 19, 2026 at 7. The mathematical reality of this specific household demonstrates the absolute victory of the moat. The initial $2,000 deficit and the terrifying vulnerability at the crossroads of the Oakland Children's Hospital have been permanently eradicated, replaced by a consolidated net worth of $1,394,145. More critically, the active-duty husband's initial $150 per month liquidity has been structurally transformed into 4 independent federal distribution vectors: VA disability, SA, DFA's military retirement, and OPM civil service, generating a guaranteed passive monthly inflow of $11,229.05, annualized at $134,748.60. Because this $134,748 guaranteed sovereign income completely covers the prohibitive cost of living in Solano County, the required drawdown on the primary capital. Reserve remains exactly 0%. The transition from the ashes of Operation Fiery Vigil and the ICU of Oakland Children's Hospital to the unreachable fortress is complete. The clinical vigil of the night shift can finally end, and the ultimate molt is achieved. 3.6. Summary. Matrix. The taxonomy of post-labor states. Structural metric. The non-moat paradigm. The hybrid moat paradigm. The moat armored paradigm. Primary capital role, survival engine. Systematic liquidation. Discretionary supplement generational defense, untouched. Standard drawdown rate, 4% to 5%. High attrition, 1.5% to 2.5%. Moderate attrition, 0 drawdown mandate. Market vulnerability, extreme catastrophic failure in early recession, moderate. Can pause withdrawals temporarily, 0. Immune to equity fluctuations. Inflation defense, none. Purchasing power erodes rapidly. Partial civilian pensions, often absolute, statutory, federal COLA. Taxation friction, high. Standard distributions taxed as ordinary income. Moderate, mixed tax treatment on corporate pensions. Minimal, asymmetric tax shielding. Medical shielding fragile, reliant on Medicare and out-of-pocket capital. Fragile, goes to civilian long-term care costs. Fortified, federal infrastructures tricare. Phenomenological state, the phantom of scarcity, perpetual anxiety, lingering vigilance, partial autonomy, grown in toto. Absolute pax and autonomy. The generational ledger, the ultimate purpose of the moat. The standard financial sector frequently misinterprets the achievement of the moat-armored paradigm as the ultimate act of self-preservation. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of ontological security. Through the lens of moral ethics, the moat is not the terminus, it is the origin point for the lineage. The zero drawdown mandate, made possible by the $134,748 in guaranteed sovereign inflows, is the mechanism by which generational defense is secured. Because the $1,394,001 liquid capital reserve is not required for retirees' day-to-day operations, it ceases to be a survival fund and becomes the generational ledger. This is the explicit architectural blueprint for the next generation, for Austin III, Aubrey Lizette, Karmina Lindsey, their spouses, and for Kiara as she approaches her 8th year. As they trudge the complex, high-friction trajectories of the American workforce, they do not do so in isolation. The moat stands behind them. The untouched capital reserve serves as a systemic backstop, demonstrating empirically that the transition from total depletion to absolute sovereign wealth is mathematically achievable in a single generation. By refusing to capitulate to the doctrine of managed attrition, the primary investigator and the supervisory practitioner have not merely secured their own retirement, they have permanently altered the socioeconomic trajectory of the family lineage. They have provided the schematic. Now, the next generation must navigate the systemic traps of the working years to build their own fortresses. To do that, they must first understand the traps that will be set against them. We must now turn our attention to the active accumulation phase and audit the forces designed to extract their labor. Treatise 2, the attrition audit. Deconstructing the systemic traps of the accumulation phase. Chapter 4, the friction of accumulation. Taxation drag, occupational overhead, and the illusion of gross income. The American workforce operates under a deeply ingrained, institutionalized regarding the nature of compensation. From the moment an individual enters the labor market, they are conditioned to measure their socioeconomic progress by a single, fundamentally flawed metric, gross income. Through the lens of moral ethics and strict empirical accounting, gross income is an abstract valuation of labor that the worker will never fully possess. To understand why standard working class and mid-level professionals remain trapped in the non-moat paradigm, we must audit the active accumulation phase and expose the invisible forces that actively drain their capital before it can ever be weaponized. This is the friction of accumulation. 4.1. The taxation drag. The first extraction. The most severe impediment to building a sovereign fortress in the civilian sector is the compounded weight of mandatory taxation. Unlike the tax-exempt vectors secured in the moat armored paradigm, such as VA, the active civilian worker is subjected to a relentless multi-tiered extraction process on every dollar of fiat currency they generate. Consider a mid-career professional in a premium state such as California, earning a gross salary of $134,000. By the time the state and federal apparatus have completed the $134,000 gross salary is frequently reduced to a net spendable liquidity of $85,000 or less. The worker is mathematically forced to run at full speed to mitigate the system's drag. They are bleeding capital before the check even clears. 4.2. The overhead, the cost of labor. The friction does not end with taxation. The standard financial model completely ignores the shadow costs of maintaining employment. This is occupational overhead. The American worker must constantly purchase the right to remain in the labor force. 1. In depreciation. The thousands of dollars spent annually on vehicles, fuel, insurance, and the extreme loss of behavioral time spent in transit. 2. Professional maintenance. The out-of-pocket costs of required certifications, professional attire, and institutional compliance. 3. The convenience, because the worker is exhausted by the 40-hour or often 60-hour demand on their biology, they are forced to outsource basic domestic labor. They pay premiums for convenience foods, childcare, and rapid home maintenance. Capital that should be compounded in their ledger, but is instead spent just to recover enough energy the next day. The biological cost of labor. As demonstrated by the 31-year clinical vigil of the night shift, labor is not merely an exchange of time for capital, it is the active expenditure of biological capital. The friction of accumulation exacts a heavy toll on the nervous system, circadian rhythm, and musculoskeletal structure. The non-moat system requires the worker to expend this biological capital until age 65 or 70, at which point the body is frequently too compromised to enjoy the fruits of the labor. The ultimate tragedy of the standard accumulation phase is that the worker spends their health acquiring wealth, only to spend that very wealth later to extend their failing health artificially. 4.4. The accumulation mandate, the forced deferment. To escape the non-moat trap, the worker must build capital. However, because taxes and overhead have severely eroded their net liquidity, saving requires profound behavioral sacrifice. The financial industry mandates that workers defer 10% to 20% of their already depleted net income into 401ks or IRAs. This creates an environment of intense, chronic financial stress. The young family is told to lock their capital away in Wall Street vehicles they cannot touch without severe penalty until age 591 halves, leaving them critically vulnerable to immediate, localized crises such as a sudden pediatric medical emergency. They are forced to starve their present biological survival to feed a distant, unpredictable future. 4.5. The lineage. To the lineage currently navigating this phase, Austin III, Aubrey Lizette, Karmina Lindsey, their spouses, and eventually Kiara, you must recognize that the system is structurally designed to keep you on the treadmill. If you attempt to build your fortress strictly through civilian W-2 gross income, the friction will pull you backward. You must seek asymmetry. You must seek career trajectories, institutional roles, and federal state vectors that offer defined benefits, tax-shielded compensation, and early-stage pension vesting. You must stop trading your finite time strictly for highly taxed fiat and begin trading your labor for permanent state-backed structural armor. Chapter 5. The Retail 401k Delusion. The mathematical danger of the private market and deferred taxation. Once the active workforce navigates the brutal friction of taxation and occupational overhead, they are funneled by the financial industry into the primary vehicle of the non-moat paradigm, the Retail 401k or Standard Individual Retirement Account, IRA. For decades, the American working class has been indoctrinated with the singular, unquestioned dogma: defer your income, invest, and compound your wealth for the future. When subjected to the rigorous empirical audit of cathartic phenomenology, This dogma is exposed not as a guarantee of ontological security but as a highly calculated wealth transfer mechanism. The retail 401(k) system shifts the absolute burden risk away from the corporation and the state, placing it squarely onto the shoulders of the individual worker. This is the retail 401(k) delusion. It is a structural trap defined by distinct mathematical and behavioral hazards that actively prevent the worker from ever achieving a true moat. 5.1. The privation of macroeconomic risk. Before the 1980s, the American working class frequently relied on defined benefit pensions, the precursor to the institutional vectors of the hybrid and moat paradigms. In a true pension system, if the stock market crashed, the corporation or the state absorbed the loss, the worker's retirement remained secure. The invention of the 401(k), a defined contribution plan, inverted this relationship. It allowed the corporate sector to completely abandon long-term liabilities and shift 100% of macroeconomic risk onto employees. When the lineage places its capital strict retail equities, it is entirely exposed to global forces beyond its control, supply chain disruptions, algorithmic trading crashes, and geopolitical conflicts. If a market correction occurs in the decade preceding their planned retirement, the worker is powerless. They cannot negotiate with a bear market. The corporation has no penalty, but the individual worker suffers total systemic failure. 5.2. The liquidity trap and the penalty of survival. When a worker defers their capital to a standard 401(k), they are granted a digital ledger displaying their balance. However, this capital is immune to a severe liquidity trap. The worker lacks behavioral autonomy over their own money. If a catastrophic localized event occurs, such as the pediatric medical crisis at Oakland Children's Hospital experienced in our empirical case study, and the family requires immediate, massive liquidity to survive, 1K system penalizes them for accessing their own labor. The government extracts a draconian 10% early withdrawal penalty, followed by full ordinary income taxation on the distribution. The worker is punished for prioritizing biological survival over instantment. The capital is trapped behind a wall of penalties, proving that the worker does not truly own the asset. They are merely leasing it back from the financial institutions under strict state-mandated conditions. 5.3. The deferred taxation time bomb. The pricing tool of the traditional 401(k) is the tax break. Workers are encouraged to defer taxes today under the assumption that they will be in a lower tax bracket when they retire. This is a dangerous speculative gamble on the macroeconomic future of the United States. Given the escalational debt and the unfunded liabilities of standard social insurance programs, assuming that federal income tax rates will be lower in the decades ahead is mathematically reckless. When the non-moat retiree eventually begins the mandated drawdown of their 401(k), every dollar withdrawn is taxed as ordinary income. The worker took all the market risks for 40 years. However, the state remains a silent, senior partner in the portfolio, legally entitled to reclaim a substantial share of the harvest at whatever tax rate the government dictates in the future. The worker has grown a crop on land they do not own. The landlord sets the rent at harvest time. 5.4. The fee, hemorrhage, the silent bleed. While the worker assumes 100% of the market risk, the financial institutions managing the 401(k) assume none, yet they extract a permanent toll. Retail investment vehicles are riddled with admin fees, expense ratios, and management costs. An insignificant 1% annual fee does not sound destructive. However, because that 1% is extracted from the total balance every single year, regardless of whether the market goes up or down, it severely retards the compounding growth curve. For a 30-year accumulation phase, that fractional fee will silently cannibalize hundreds of thousands of dollars of the worker's potential wealth. The financial institution profits while the worker finances the delay of their own ultimate molt. 5.5. Strategic directive for the lineage. To the lineage, the 401(k) is not inherently evil, it is a tool, and capitalizing on an employer match is a tactical necessity. However, it must never be the primary foundation of your architectural defense. If your entire future relies on the unpredictable fluctuations of Wall Street, you are building a non-moat architecture. To achieve the ultimate molt, you must actively seek out and secure institutional vectors that do not force you to carry the macroeconomic risk. You must pursue career paths, whether through federal service, specialized healthcare tenure, or robust state infrastructure, that guarantee defined benefits, tax-sheltered income, and indexed annuities. You must transition from a retail investor, hoping for a favorable market, to a sovereign operator protected by the statutory armor of the state. Chapter 6. The Biological Cost of Labor. Escalating civilian healthcare costs as a wealth extraction mechanism. The failure of the non-moat paradigm is not a failure of financial planning, it is a failure of biological reality. The standard American worker is conditioned to believe that if they optimize their 401k and manage their taxation, their ontological security is guaranteed. This assumption completely ignores the apex predator of accumulated capital, the civilian healthcare apparatus. Through the empirical observation of a 31-year clinical vigil within a Northern California mega healthcare infrastructure, the true nature of this system is undeniable. In the United States, healthcare is not merely a biological necessity, it is a rapid, hyper-efficient wealth extraction mechanism. It is the medical hemorrhage, the single greatest threat to generational wealth transfer. 6.1. The illusion of Medicare sufficiency. The American workforce operates under the dangerous assumption that reaching age 65 triggers a state-sponsored safety net called Medicare, which will fully insulate their biology in their final decades. This is a profound structural delusion. Standard Medicare, Parts A and B, is a porous defense. It covers foundational hospitalization and standard outpatient care, but it leaves massive gaps. It does not cover dental, vision, hearing, or, most critically, the catastrophic out-of-pocket costs of prolonged acute care or civilian long-term care facilities. To plug these holes, the non-moat retiree is forced to purchase expensive civilian supplemental insurance, MAP, and Part D plans. Thus, even in retirement, the individual is forced to pay a perpetual biological tax back into the corporate healthcare system to maintain access to survival. The catastrophic extraction, the ICU reality. The true danger of the medical hemorrhage fundamentally fails. When an individual suffers a severe cardiac event, a neurological crisis, or requires advanced oncological intervention, the math of standard wealth management collapses instantly. Consider the reality of the intensive care unit, ICU, and the neonatal pediatric wards, served daily during the 23-to-7 night shift. When a civilian without the moat armored defense enters critical care, their accumulated private wealth is rapidly siphoned into the institutional ledger. 2. The out-of-network ambush. In a medical crisis, the patient has no operational control over which specialist on call. If an out-of-network surgeon or anesthesiologist intervenes to save their life, the resulting surprise billing bypasses the insurance shield entirely, attacking the primary capital reserve directly. This is where the doctrine of managed attrition becomes a tragedy. A non-moat retiree may have carefully budgeted a 4% annual withdrawal from their $400,000 portfolio. A single 3-week ICU admission and subsequent rehabilitation can demand an unplanned $50,000 liquidation. The portfolio is instantly, permanently crippled. The capital meant to sustain at age 80 was consumed at age 68 to survive the month. 6.3. The long-term care black hole. The most devastating wealth extraction mechanism in the civilian sector is long-term custodial care. Because Medicare explicitly does not cover long-term nursing home or extended in-home biological assistance, the non-moat retiree is entirely exposed. With standard memory care or skilled nursing facilities routinely exceeding $100,000 annually, the family is forced to liquidate the individual's entire life savings actively. The $1 million portfolio, which the worker bled for 40 years to accumulate, enduring the friction of taxation and the 401k delusion, is entirely consumed by the healthcare apparatus in less than a decade. Once the capital is completely exhausted, the individual is forced into state Medicaid dependency. The generational ledger is erased. There is no inheritance. The system successfully extracted the wealth. The MOAT on 4. The MOAT armored countermeasure. The only defense against the medical hemorrhage is absolute institutional shielding. The MOAT armored paradigm defeats this apex predator through action. When a medical crisis strikes the MOAT, the biological trauma is severe, but the financial ledger remains untouched. The fortress holds. 6.5. The final warning to the lineage. To the lineage, your biology is finite, and the system is designed to monetize your physical decline. Out, save the American healthcare system using a standard retail portfolio. If you remain in the non-MOAT paradigm, your final act on Earth will be the forced liquidation of your legacy to a civilian hospital corporation. You must build the MOAT. You must secure institutional healthcare shield before your biology begins to fail. You must weaponize your career choices now, so that when the biological crisis inevitably arrives, you are fighting only for your life, not for your generational survival. Treatise 3. The transitional engine and state-backed armor. The active workforce blueprint for securing institutional vectors. The audit is complete. The systemic traps of the accumulation phase, taxation drag, retail equity vulnerability, and the medical hemorrhage have been exposed. It is now empirically evident that attempting to build ontological security solely through the private civilian W-2 salary is mathematically inefficient and inherently fragile. To achieve the ultimate developmental molt and secure a MOAT-armored paradigm, the active workforce must enact a fundamental shift in strategy. They must transition from being retail subjects of a fragile economy to citizens protected by the state apparatus. This treatise serves as the operational blueprint for the lineage. It details the tactical career decisions, the institutional alignments, and the precise mechanics required to construct the state-backed armor. Chapter 7. The Federal Service Multiplier. Maximizing VA, DFAs, and OPM vectors. The foundation of the absolute MOAT is constructed by deliberately stacking independent, non-correlated streams of institutional revenue. While the civilian sector offers a single, highly taxed salary and pushes all macroeconomic risk onto the employee, the defense sectors offer the federal service multiplier, the ability to generate multiple, lifelong tax-advantaged annuities based on cumulative service credits. To build the $134,748 guaranteed sovereign inflow demonstrated in our empirical case study, the active workforce must understand how to navigate and secure these specific vectors. 7.1. The DFS vector, the uniformed foundation. The most powerful early-stage structural defense is secured through uniformed service under the Department of Defense. 7.2. The VA vector, the Department of Veterans Affairs, VA, disability compensation vector, is the ultimate asymmetrical financial weapon. It is the single most powerful component of the MOAT armored paradigm because it operates entirely outside the standard American tax framework. 1. The mechanic, the military operational environment, is inherently destructive to human biology. Compensation awarded for service-connected biological or psychological wear and tear is classified as a tax-free entitlement. 2. The tactical advantage, as demonstrated in the empirical case study, a $59,045 annualized VA inflow has the net purchasing power of a civilian gross salary double that amount because it incurs zero federal, state, or FICA tax drag. It is pure, unadulterated liquidity. It is the statutory indemnification for the biological cost of labor. 7. The OPM vector, the civilian federal engine, for those who do not pursue uniformed service or for veterans executing a second career, the federal civil service system, governed by OPM, offers the next strongest layer of institutional defense. 1. The mechanic, the federal employment system, FRS, is a robust, three-tiered architecture. It combines a defined benefit annuity, the basic pension, a matched institutional 401k equivalent, the thrift savings plan, and standard Social Security. 2. The tactical advantage. Unlike civilian corporate employees who rely solely on their 401ks, federal workers are guaranteed a mathematical baseline. Because the United States Treasury guarantees the OPM annuity, it removes the sequence of returns risk from a massive portion of the retiree's future income. 7.4. The stacking scheme, the dual-engine approach. The true moat is achieved not by securing one of these vectors, but by systematically stacking them. This requires strategic, multi-decade career planning. The most impenetrable financial architecture is built by an individual who executes a primary career in uniformed service, securing the DFAs and VA vectors, followed immediately by a secondary career in federal civil service or a heavily unionized pension-backed state institution, securing the OPM vector. When these three streams are combined with standard Social Security (SSA) at age 62 or 67, this multiplier is fully realized. The operator has successfully generated 4 independent, state-backed cash flows. Reliance on the stock market is reduced to 0. The moat is mathematically complete. 7.5 Directive for the lineage. To the lineage, you must evaluate career trajectory, not by the gross salary it offers today, but by the structural armor it provides tomorrow. If your current corporate employer offers a high salary but zero long-term institutional backing, you are trading your finite time for fragile capital. You must seek roles, whether in defense, federal health infrastructure, or state education, that offer service credits, defined benefits, and tax-advantaged compensation. Do not wait until you are 50 to realize the system is designed to extract your wealth. Pivot your trajectory now. Trade your labor for the armor of the state. Chapter 8. Inflation networks. Cost of living adjustments as a sovereign shield. In the architecture of the moat, achieving a high initial cash flow is only the first phase of defense. The true test of any retirement paradigm is its ability to withstand the relentless, compounding degradation of macroeconomic. For the standard civilian retiree operating in the non-moat paradigm, inflation is a silent, lethal extraction mechanism. A fixed corporate annuity, or a rigid 4% withdrawal strategy that feels luxurious at age 60, will be mathematically hollowed out by age 75. The moat-armored operator does not suffer this degradation. They have secured the ultimate economic security system, the statutory cost of living adjustment, COLA. By anchoring their survival to inflation-indexed federal networks, the operator forces the United States government to perpetually absorb the macroeconomic risk of an economy on its behalf. This is not merely financial planning, it is the deployment of a sovereign shield. 8.1 The mathematics of the sovereign shield. Unlike fixed private pensions, the 4 foundational vectors of the moat, VA, DFAs, OPM, and SSA, are legally tethered to the Consumer Price Index for urban wage earners and clerical workers, CPIW. This statutory link fundamentally alters the trajectory of the operator's wealth. 1. The non-moat vulnerability. If inflation spikes to 6% each year, the standard retail investor must either actively cut their lifestyle by 6% or liquidate 6% more of their fragile private portfolio to maintain their purchasing power, accelerating their own mathematical ruin. 2. The moat immunity. When the same 6% inflation spike occurs, the moat-armored operator takes zero action. By federal statute, VA, DFAs, OPM, and SSA distributions automatically scale upward. Consider the empirical case study, a guaranteed passive inflow of $134,748. If the macroeconomy experiences a sustained inflationary period with COLA increases of 15% over 5 years, the moat's baseline income automatically expands to $154,960. The operator did not have to negotiate for a raise. They did not have to execute a risky stock trade. They did not have to increase their drawdown rate. Sovereign shield automatically expanded to cover the increased cost of survival. 8.2. The asymmetry of the VA vector. The most potent application of the COLA shield lies within the Department of Veterans Affairs, VA, Disability Compensation Program. As established in Chapter 7, VA vector is entirely immune to federal and state taxation. When COLA is applied to this specific stream, the mathematical advantage is asymmetric. 1. If a standard corporate worker receives a 5% cost of living raise, that new income is immediately taxed at their highest marginal tax rate, the reduction of the gross increase. 2. When a MOAT armored operator receives a 5% COLA increase on a $59,145 VA vector, they retain 100% of the newly generated liquidity. The shield expands with zero friction, providing absolute, untaxed protection against economic degradation. 8.3. The phenomenological impact of COLA. The psychological weight of this specific mechanism cannot be overstated. When subjected to cathartic phenomenology, the standard retiree's experience of inflation is one of creeping dread. Every trip to the grocery, every property tax reassessment, and every increase in utility bills is a stark reminder that their finite capital is dying. The MOAT armored operator experiences inflation not as a threat, but as a minor logistical update to the ledger. Because their income is structurally guaranteed to chase the cost of the nervous system remains in a state of pax. The phantom of scarcity is mathematically starved of oxygen. The operator knows, with absolute empirical certainty, that their purchasing power in their final decade of life will be equal to or greater than their purchasing power on their first day of retirement. 4. The compounding power of the untouched ledger. The true architectural brilliance of the COLA shield is its secondary effect on the generational ledger, the primary capital reserve. Because federal cash flow perpetually scales to cover all living expenses, the zero is maintained. The $1,394,145 liquid capital reserve is never required to fight inflation. It is allowed to remain entirely within compounding equities for decades. While the federal cash flow oversees the operational survival of the present, the untouched capital reserve captures the explosive growth of the global market for the future. The operator enjoys the upside of Wall Street without ever being subjected to its downside risk. 8.5. Directive for the lineage. To the lineage, you must prioritize the quality of your future income or quantity of your current accumulation. A $3,000 monthly pension that is legally indexed to inflation is structurally superior to a fixed $4,000 corporate annuity that will never increase. You must actively pursue institutional roles in federal service vectors that legally guarantee investments. Do not accept financial architecture that places the burden of inflation strictly on your own shoulders. You must build a system where the state is legally obligated to protect your purchasing power until the end of your life. That is the only way to ensure the fortress remains unbreachable. Chapter 9. Geographic arbitrage and tactical positioning. Deploying the MOAT for absolute autonomy. The final operational phase of constructing the MOAT armored paradigm is the mastery of physical space. Wealth, no matter how vast or shielded, is always subjected to the macroeconomic laws of its physical location. For the non-MOAT and hybrid MOAT retiree, geography is frequently a prison. Because their architectures are fragile and susceptible to inflation and taxation, they are often forced to execute a tactical retreat, fleeing premium, high-cost economic zones to lower their required drawdown rate artificially. Their physical location is dictated by mathematical desperation. For the MOAT armored operator, geography is a canvas. Because the sovereign vectors, VA, DFS, OPM, SSA, generate massive inflation-indexed liquidity that is immune to localized tax drag, the operator achieves total geographic autonomy. The choice of where to live, the locus, is no longer a financial calculation. It is a sovereign, phenomenological choice. 9.1. The premium coastal stance, the Solano corridor model. Stress test of the MOAT armored paradigm is its ability to hold ground in one of the most hostile macroeconomic environments on Earth, the premium coastal zones of California. As demonstrated in our empirical case study, the Fairfield-Vacaville-Vallejo corridor of Solano County is characterized by intense, extreme property valuations and high localized inflation. 1. The standard defeat. A standard, non-moat retiree with a $1.39 million portfolio cannot survive here without rapidly cannibalizing their principal. The state income tax, property reassessments, and massive cost of living shatter the 4% rule within a decade, forcing them to abandon their home and their proximity to their lineage. 2. The moat victory. The moat armored operator thrives here. Because the $134,748 guaranteed baseline completely covers the overhead, the operator can enjoy the premium climate and proximity to family without ever tapping the generational ledger. The moat allows the operator to stand firm in the fire without burning. 9.2. The tax haven multiplier. For the operator seeking maximum mathematical velocity, the moat can be deployed in zero-income tax states, such as Wyoming, South Dakota, or Florida, while the VA vector is tax-free everywhere. Moving the OPM DFAs and SSA vectors into a state with zero income tax instantly multiplies the net spendable liquidity of the entire architecture. The operator really gives themselves a massive permanent raise without increasing their risk profile. This excess liquidity can then be funneled directly into the generational ledger or deployed for high-conviction philanthropic fieldwork. 9.3 Medical geography, the ultimate priority. The most critical geographic calculation for the moat-armored operator is not the tax rate, it is proximity to the institutional medical shield. The tragic flaw of standard geographic arbitrage is that retirees often flee to ultra-low-cost, economically depressed states only to discover that the local healthcare infrastructure is catastrophically. When a severe biological crisis strikes, the cheap housing cannot save them. The moat-armored operator dictates their locus based on biological defense. Because they are untethered from the need to find cheap real estate, they can tactically position themselves within the operational radius of premium federal healthcare infrastructures, specifically Tier 1 Veterans Health Administration, VA, medical centers, or major DoD TRICARE medical hubs. By anchoring the moat within these specific geographic corridors, such as the Travis Air Force Base, David Grant USAF Medical Center footprint in Northern California, the offers immediate, zero-cost access to elite medical care, completely neutralizing the geographic isolation that traps standard retirees. 9.4. The choice of the locus, the ascetic directive. The moat-armored operator does not choose their location out of fear of running out of money. They choose their location based on the principles of moral ethics and the mandate of stewardship. They choose to live where they can best mentor the lineage. They choose to live where they can maintain Nemosin Press's archives. They choose to live near the historical and familial loci that provide meaning to their existence. They are grown in, they have reclaimed their time, their biology, and their physical space. 9.5% directive for the lineage. To the lineage, understand that geography is a tool, not a trap. If you build your financial architecture entirely within the non-moat paradigm, you will eventually be forced to leave your home, your family, and your preferred climate to survive the math of your own retirement. You must build the moat so that when your vigil ends, you have the absolute autonomy to stand your ground. You must build the armor so that your choice of where to live is dictated by love, purpose, and legacy, never by fear. Treatise, The Sovereign, Manual, and the Ultimate Molt. The psychological and generational realization of the moat. The mathematics of survival are solved. The institutional vectors are locked. The sovereign shield of Kola is active, and the geographic loci are secured. The structural architect moat is complete. However, the transition from accumulation to distribution is not merely a financial transaction. It is a profound biological and psychological change in basic assumptions. For decades, the human nervous system has been hardwired to equate survival with the relentless, active generation. When the final shift ends, When the vigil is over, the mind must be consciously decoupled from the friction it has endured for 35 years. This final treatise is the sovereign manual. It is the guide to executing the ultimate developmental molt, discarding the psychological armor of the working class, eradicate the phantom of scarcity, and stepping fully into the state of being grown in toto. Chapter 10. Eradicating the phantom of scarcity. The deconstruction of evolutionary anxiety. The most dangerous threat to a newly established moat-armored operator is not a stock market crash, it is the neurobiology. Despite having a $1.39 million liquid reserve and a guaranteed $134,748 annual cash flow that fully covers all operating expenses, operators frequently report a sudden creeping dread in the early months of retirement. This is the phantom of scarcity. It is the irrational terror that the fortress will somehow fail, that the capital will evaporate, and that the operator will be cast back into the vulnerability of the negative $2,000 deficit they began with decades prior. 10.1. The neurobiology of the accumulation trap, a failure of logic. It is a highly tuned evolutionary success story operating out of context. For hundreds of thousands of years, human survival depended on hypervigilance regarding resources. The brain's limbic system is designed to reward the active gathering of resources with dopamine and to punish with cortisol. During the 35-year accumulation phase, the operator's brain linked the physical act of labor, the 12-hour shifts, the military deployments, to the influx of resources. When the vigil ends, the daily behavioral loop of hunting and gathering, earning a W-2 paycheck, suddenly stops. The amygdala detects the cessation of the gathering action and triggers a physiological alarm. Even though the passive state-backed inflow of resources is mathematically superior to the previous physical labor, the primitive brain misinterprets the end of the career as the onset of a famine. The anxiety is simply the nervous system updated, obsolete survival script. 10.2. The phenomenological dissonance. The phantom is amplified by phenomenological dissonance. The scars of the past always color the subjective experience of the present. When an operator has historically survived catastrophic geopolitical, Operation Fiery Vigil, severe medical trauma, Oakland Children's Hospital, and the grueling multi-decade nocturnal trench warfare of civilian healthcare, the body remembers that extreme precarity. The mind projects the agonizing struggles of the past onto the absolute safety of the present, creating a phantom threat where none currently exists. 10.3. The execution of cathartic phenomenology. To defeat the phantom, the operator must utilize cathartic phenomenology. They must actively observe their own fear, isolate it, and subject it to empirical destruction. When the creeping dread of not having enough arises, the operator must not suppress it. They must hold it up against the hard math of the ledger. They must verbally and cognitively reaffirm the architecture. 1. The United States Treasury secures the baseline. 2. The federal infrastructure secures the medical. 3. The drawdown on the primary capital is exactly 0. By repeatedly forcing the primitive brain to acknowledge the moat's mathematical invincibility, the neurobiological alarm is eventually starved of fuel. The cortisol loop is broken. The operator stops bracing for an impact that will never come. The phantom of scarcity dissolves, leaving only the profound, transcendent silence of Pax. Chapter 11. The absolute reclamation of time. Behavioral autonomy and the rejection of the leisure myth. In the American socio-economic system, time is an unrenewable commodity. During the accumulation phase, the worker is forced into a brutal transaction. They must trade their finite biological time for the fiat currency required to survive. For over 3 decades, time belonged to the federal agency, the hospital infrastructure, the supervisor, and the commute. True, definitive victory of the moat-armored paradigm is not the accumulation of $1,394,145. It is what that capital executes. The moat buys back the remaining timeline of the human biological lifespan. When Karmi's final 2003-7 night shift concludes on July 19, 2026. At exactly 7, it is not merely the end of a career. It is the absolute reclamation of time. From that minute forward, the locus of control shifts permanently back to the sovereign operator. 11.1. The tabular myth of leisure. When the phantom of scarcity is eradicated, the operator is left with a profound blank slate, the tabula rasa. The retail financial industry markets this phase through a highly sanitized, intellectually vacant lens. The working class sells images of endless golf courses, cruise ships, and passive leisure. This is a corporate illusion designed to keep the population docile and focused on consumption. Through the framework of moral ethics, a retirement consisting solely of passive leisure is a squandered molt. An operator who has survived catastrophic geopolitical displacement, intense clinical vigil, and decades of institutional discipline does not simply shut down their cognitive and moral engines. Absolute leisure leads to rapid biological and cognitive atrophy. The moat was not built so the operator could do nothing. The moat was built so the operator could do exactly what they choose. This is behavioral autonomy. 11.2. The deployment of behavioral autonomy, the ascetic directive. With operational survival entirely automated by the federal distribution vectors, the operator's reclaimed time is instantly redirected toward high-conviction, non-extractive pursuits. The focus shifts entirely from accumulating capital to elevating humanity in toto. For the primary investigator, this behavioral autonomy manifests as profound scholastic stewardship. The reclaimed time is weaponized to build and manage Mnemosyne Press International, LLC. It is dedicated to field studies, exploring historical events and geographical locations to extract profound empirical lessons for the lineage. 3. The ascetic non-profit mission, advocating for the pillars of veritas, truth, equitas, equity, pax, peace, and prosperity. Because the operator's financial baseline is unbreachable, they do not need to monetize their research to survive. They can set a fixed price for their textbooks. For example, $19.45. They can give the knowledge away. The market no longer dictates their labor. It is dictated purely by the moral imperative to teach. 11.3. The ultimate molt, grown in toto. This is what it means to be fully grown in toto. The operator has molted the shell of the worker. They have molted the anxiety of the provider. They have stepped into the final of the avuncular steward. They are older people who have survived the war of accumulation, built the fortress, and now stand atop the wall, mapping the terrain for those who must follow. Their time is their own. Their biology is shielded. Their mind is free to contemplate the highest philosophical without the immediate interruption of a utility bill or a market crash. They have reached the pinnacle of the human socio-economic experience. Chapter 12. Generational wealth transfer. Leaving the ledger for the lineage. The final structural act of the moat armored transfer of the architecture. The moat was not built to die with its creators. It was built to serve as the permanent, unshakable foundation for the lineage. 12.1. The untouched capital as a generational backstop. As established in Treatise 1, the zero drawdown mandate ensures the $1,394,145 liquid capital reserve remains fundamentally untouched. Over a 20 or 30-year distribution phase, this reserve will compound significantly. This capital is not merely an inheritance, it is the generational ledger. It acts as a system for Austin III, Aubrey Lizette, Karmina Lindsey, and Kiara. If the lineage encounters its own catastrophic crossroads, a localized economic collapse, severe medical trauma, or geopolitical displacement, the moat stands ready to absorb the impact. The children will never have to start from a negative dollar deficit. The structural vulnerability of the family line has been permanently eradicated in a single generation. 12.2. The transfer of the blueprint. However, capital without an operational manual is fragile. The greatest asset transferred to the lineage is not the fiat currency. It is very textbook. The lineage must understand why the moat exists. They must understand the terrifying friction of the accumulation phase, the 401k delusion, and the medical hemorrhage, so that they do not unthinkingly walk into the traps that their parents bled to escape. They must study the federal service multiplier and the power of inflation index networks to build their own moats. 12.3 Directive to the lineage. To the lineage reading this manual in the future, the vigil of the night shift is over. The ashes of Operation Fiery Vigil have been swept away. The crossroads of Oakland Children's Hospital survived. The fortress is complete. The state-backed armor holds. Your duty is not simply to inherit the moat, but to study its architecture, respect the extreme sacrifice required to lay its foundation, and use its protection to achieve your own ultimate molt. You are now free to become fully grown in toto. Back matter. Glossary of terms. The lexicon of ontological security, absolute reclamation of time, the ultimate objective of the moat-armored paradigm. The state achieved when operational survival is fully automated by sovereign distributions, allowing the operator to claim their finite biological time and redirect it toward non-extractive, high-conviction pursuits. Equitas, veritas, pax, prosperitas, the pillars, the foundational virtues governing the moat operator. Veritas, truth in empirical data. Equitas, equity in sharing the architecture. Demonstrated by the ascetic pricing of this text. Pax, peace, the biological absence of financial dread. And prosperitas, true prosperity, the elevation of the lineage rather than the mere accumulation of fiat currency. Ascetic directive, the mandate adopted by the sovereign operator upon achieving the moat. It involves the total rejection of the corporate leisure myth and the conscious redirection of reclaimed time toward high-conviction, non-extractive pursuits, such as scholastic stewardship, mentorship, and the management of Nimocene Press. Avuncular, the ultimate developmental stage of the moat operator. The individual who has successfully transitioned from the role of active accumulator and provider to the role of protector, architect, and guide for the subsequent lineage. Behavioral autonomy, the state of total operational freedom achieved when survival is decoupled from active labor and market performance. The goal of the moat is to allow the operators to dictate their own geographic locus and daily actions without macroeconomic friction. Biological cost of labor, the physiological and cognitive degradation extracted from the worker during the accumulation. It encompasses the physical toll of nocturnal shift work. For example, the 31-year, 23-7 clinical vigil, chronic stress, and the musculoskeletal wear and tear required to generate W-2% income. Cathartic phenomenology, the primary observation utilized in this text. The rigorous practice of stripping away systemic rhetoric and sanitized financial marketing to observe the raw, lived reality of the human worker. It is the mechanism by which the phantom of scarcity is exposed and dismantled. Editorial 7. A collaborative site group composed of de-identified senior executive service, SES, retirees, and institutional veterans, responsible for the rigorous combing, vetting, and validation of the systemic projections and structural truths published by Nimocene Press International. Federal Service Multiplier, the relation of multiple independent institutional service credits, specifically via DFAs, VA, and OPM, to generate overlapping, state-backed, and inflation-indexed revenue streams, completely bypassing the volatility of the retail stock market. Friction of accumulation, the compounding forces, primarily taxation drag, inflation, and occupational overhead, commuting, professional maintenance, that actively drain a worker's gross income, severely retarding their ability to build liquid capital. Generational ledger, the primary liquid capital reserve, for example, the $1.39 million portfolio, that the zero drawdown mandate protects. Because it is not required for retirees' daily survival, it shifts from a survival asset to a permanent, compounding structural backstop for the family lineage. Grown in toto, the ultimate developmental molt, the state of achieving ontological security, behavioral autonomy, and the total integration of one's moral, economic, and existential existence. It marks the permanent transition from being a subject acted upon by macroeconomic forces to a sovereign operator. Hybrid moat paradigm. The transitional retirement characterized by partial institutional reliance, for example, a single civilian pension, combined with a reduced but still necessary variable drawdown from a private portfolio. It offers partial autonomy but remains vulnerable to latest-stage inflation and medical hemorrhage. Locus, loci, the specifical, geographical, or historical spaces where profound human struggle intersects with macroeconomic forces, for example, the Fairfield-Vacaville Corridor, Oakland Children's Hospital, or the ashes of Operation Fiery Vigil. Managed attrition, the inherently flawed doctrine of standard retail retirement, for example, the percent rule. It requires the individual to systematically liquidate their finite capital reserves to sustain themselves, placing them in an adversarial relationship with their own lifespan. Medical hemorrhage, the apex predator of accumulated private capital. The rapid extraction of wealth executed by the civilian healthcare apparatus via catastrophic out-of-pocket expenses, out-of-network ICU ambushes, and civilian long-term care facilities. Moat armored paradigm, the highest tier of socioeconomic defense. A financial architecture built upon a zero drawdown mandate, sustained and guaranteed, tax-advantaged, and inflation-indexed institutional distribution vectors, for example, VA, DFAs, OPM, SSA. It provides absolute immunity to market crashes and geographic friction. Moral ethics, note, intentionally lowercase and unhyphenated. Philosophical framework governing the profound ethical weight of structural responsibility. It is the demanding standard that dictates the absolute protection of the family structure, the refusal to capitulate at critical crossroads, and the mandate to weaponize one's existence for the elevation of the lineage. Non-moat paradigm, the hyper-vulnerable default state of the standard American retiree. An architecture built entirely on managed attrition, forcing the individual into a mathematically doomed zero-sum relationship with their own lifespan, completely exposed to the triad of fragility, ontological security, unshakable state of psychological and structural safety. It is achieved when an individual's physical, biological, and economic survival is completely insulated from external macroeconomic variables, thereby allowing the nervous system to disengage from evolutionary survival loops permanently. Operation Fiery Vigil. The historical June 1991 emergency evacuation of U.S. personnel from the Philippines following the eruption of Mount Pinatubo. It represents the absolute negative $2,000 deficit of the empirical case study, establishing the baseline from which the moat was constructed. Phantom scarcity, the profound creeping dread experienced during the transition from active labor to distribution. It is an obsolete neurobiological survival script triggered by the cessation of physical labor, causing the amygdala to misinterpret retirement as a resource shortage, despite the empirical invincibility of the ledger. Sequence of returns risk, SRR. The mathematical reality that the order of market returns is more critical than the average market returns during the distribution phase. A severe market correction in the early years of a non-moat retirement forces the liquidation of depreciated assets, causing permanent, unrecoverable portfolio. Sovereign shield, COLA, the deployment of statutory federal cost of living adjustments to automatically scale a retiree's income against macroeconomic inflation, forcing the government to perpetually absorb the risk of a fluctuating economy on behalf of the operator. Tabula rasa, the profound of reclaimed time presented to the sovereign operator upon the cessation of the final working shift. Zero drawdown mandate, the foundational mathematical requirement of the moat. It is achieved when guaranteed institutional cash flow fully eclipses total baseline and discretionary living expenses, required withdrawal rate of 0% from the primary capital reserve. Agyaman tayo ken niya po Jesus.